On today's video, we're going to be ranking Florida's largest cities by safety. We're going to focus on Florida's 5 largest cities: Jacksonville, Miami, Tampa, St. Pete, and Orlando, rating these cities from safest to the most dangerous. We're going to be looking at crime statistics combined with real life experience. Before we get started, let me give you guys some context on this topic. It would make sense for us to do the top 10 largest cities, but some of those cities are suburbs. Then we could do the top 10 largest metropolitan areas, but it's really unfair to compare a city like Sarasota or Naples to a city like Miami. Thus, I've decided that on today's video, we're only going to focus on the 5 largest cities. Today, many people believe that large cities are the most dangerous places to live. And while that may be the case in other states throughout the country, it is not the case in the state of Florida. For the most part, Florida's large cities are exemplary, and it's actually the smaller towns in Florida that have the most poverty and the most dangerous places to live. So I made a small list for today's video of the top 10 places in Florida with the highest homicide rates. In the year 2020, large cities across America saw their homicide rates skyrocket. In the case of Florida, the city of Fort Lauderdale, which usually has a homicide rate under 11 per 100,000, doubled it to 20 per 100,000. But luckily, the rest of the large cities in Florida didn't have that problem. Highlighted in yellow, you can see that the vast majority of the most dangerous places in Florida were small towns, with the city of Jasper having the highest in the state of Florida. At 55 people per 100,000, that's about 3 times more deadly than the largest city on the list, Jacksonville. We can see that Jacksonville did make the list of the most dangerous cities, and some parts of Dade County would also have ended up on this list. But you can clearly denote how the most dangerous places by homicide rate in Florida are predominantly small rural counties. And these are not outliers, as these small counties have been doing this back to back year after year. So despite the popular opinion that large cities are more dangerous, in the state of Florida, you are much more likely to be in a dangerous small town than you are to be in a dangerous large city, with the exception of Jacksonville. When you look at pockets of poverty, you'll also see that 6 out of 10 of the poorest places in Florida happen to be small towns. Only 4 are part of large metro areas. So the notion that large cities are dangerous and poor and crime-ridden simply cannot be proven analytically. This has mostly been spread by rural radio, mainstream media, but the reality remains that at least in the state of Florida, you are much safer in a large city than you are in a small town. Recently, you may have heard in the media that Doral, Florida is being taken over by Venezuelan gangs, and it's becoming a very dangerous place. Doral is a suburb of Miami, Florida, with a predominantly Venezuelan population. We looked at the homicide rates for Doral, and it is an exceptionally safe suburb. In fact, it's one of the safest suburbs I've ever seen analytically. Despite a large population, they've had years where they haven't even had a single homicide. But now all of a sudden, mainstream media wants to point out that there's Venezuelan gangs and that there's Venezuelans coming here illegally. So all of a sudden, a single news story out of Doral makes national headlines. However, the fact that it's been one of the safest suburbs in America has never made headlines. So we have to understand that the public perception is many times manipulated by mainstream media in the way that they want to portray these communities. In the case of Doral, Florida, mainstream media wants to portray Venezuelans as criminals because they want to focus on illegal immigration, and Venezuelans are one of the largest groups coming into the United States right now. So what do? They grab this one single rare story out of Doral and they slap it all across media across the United States. But in reality, they forgot to tell you that these Venezuelans created one of the safest suburbs that's ever existed in the United States of America. So we have to understand that public perception is being manipulated heavily by mainstream media according to their agendas. In the case of Doral, they want to make Venezuelans look like these dangerous mobster criminals that are coming here and taking over America. But when you actually look at the real crime analytics for Doral, Florida, it's actually one of the safest places you could ever live. So as usual for our YouTube channel, before we get into the list, I want to go ahead and just clear out some of the misunderstandings that people have so that you have the proper context to understand today's video. On our channel, we don't just repeat mainstream rhetoric. We actually dive into these topics and get you guys real information. And that turns a lot of people off because when they hear my informative videos, what I'm telling you doesn't really correlate with the picture that mainstream media has been painting to people. And for some people, it's more than they can bear to hear the truth. Number one is St. Petersburg, Florida. Now, many years back, that would not have been the case. But as of 2024, St. Petersburg, Florida is now the safest large city in Florida. Pinellas County's homicide rate is now at under 5 per 100,000, well below the state average. Many years back, St. Petersburg would have been competing for the worst large cities in Florida. So what happened in this city that made it change for the better? And how did it become the safest large city in Florida practically overnight? I've put a lot of thought and research into this question, and I really haven't came up with a conclusive answer. So I'm just going to give you guys my personal opinion. I think what's made St. Petersburg a better city is access to beaches. See, Miami is just too crowded. Orlando doesn't have beaches. Tampa is far inland, thus the natural choice for somebody moving to Florida wanting to be near a beach would be St. Petersburg. St. Pete offers you the opportunity to live in a large city, yet still have access to great Florida beaches, something that the other cities cannot offer, and thus this has attracted the right people to their community. St. Pete has also catered to a younger professional crowd, attracting a lot of young people, and thus it's really become a center for events. Another reason why St. Petersburg has become an important player in Florida is because it has one of the largest downtowns by geographical area, and the downtown area is very drivable, not congested like other cities. As investment poured into St. Petersburg, they were able to take advantage of a grid pattern. Not only do you get to live in a beach town that has a large downtown, but the entire area is usually not congested. Moving further into Pinellas County, that changes drastically, but for the most part, a city that offers safety, a large downtown, and access to beaches is a clear destination for a lot of people, young people, relocating to Florida. And the traffic congestion nightmares that plague other part of the state are not that much of a problem here. Back in the day, St. Petersburg, Florida was a segregated city. Today, St. Petersburg has an affluent African American community, and while the city has a white area and a black area, I would describe it more as communities versus segregation. And this has attracted a lot of affluent African Americans, particularly young people, to move to St. Petersburg, to live in a large city, feel safe, feel comfortable in their own skin. Try that in a small town. However, the city still struggles with particular neighborhoods that still have bad crime rates, and unfortunately they are in the south side of the city around the African American areas. While overall St. Petersburg is still much safer than the vast majority of cities in the United States, there's still definitely a lot of room for improvement. And while Pinellas County has a very low homicide rate, it is still struggling with a high overdose death rate, so drug addiction continues to be a problem in this part of the state. St. Petersburg has always had a lot of potential, but those high crime rate areas held the entire city back. Fortunately, they've been able to control that problem, and now the city as a whole is starting to look like the safest place to live in Florida if you're looking for a large city. Number 2 is Orlando, Florida. With all of the urban counties and surrounding rural counties having homicide rates below the state average, That makes the Orlando area fairly safe. Sure, a metropolitan area the size of Orlando will definitely have some bad neighborhoods, but for the most part, Orlando is a very safe city. The counties that comprise the Orlando area have great low homicide rates, and the drug overdose death rates were some of the lowest in the state of Florida until recently. So it seems like drugs are starting to creep into Orlando, and that could definitely cause some problems in the long run. But for now, Orlando continues to enjoy some of the safest counties you'll find in Florida if you want to live in a large city. After Hurricane Maria, many people from Puerto Rico resettled to the Orlando area, and the state of Florida now has a larger Puerto Rican population than a Cuban population. Thus, Orlando, with its Puerto Rican community, is now the largest Latino community in the state of Florida. While many people think about Miami as being the largest Latino community with its Cuban community there are now more Puerto Ricans in Florida than Cubans. More spread out through North Florida, it's also starting to encompass a lot of rural areas. So if you're moving to the Orlando area, you'll be able to enjoy great Puerto Rican cuisine. So if you enjoy good parties and salsa music, you no longer have to move to Miami to have that strong Caribbean vibe. The Orlando area is also now a huge hub for Latino Americans. One of the benefits of living in Orlando is that the city has a lot of events and things to do. Last year, we went to the Florida Classic, which is a street car show. The event attracted tens of thousands of people from all over the South. We were out there until late at night, and we didn't notice anything violent or anybody out of control. So even these large events in Orlando seem to stay fairly safe. Some years back, Orlando did have a very tragic event happen at a large event, and thus anytime there's large events in the city of Orlando, the police presence is absolutely massive. They really cannot risk having something like this repeat again. And thus, if you're going to a large event in Orlando, you're going to notice that the police presence will be very strong. And really, most people are just trying to have a good time and enjoy themselves, and they're happy that this large police presence is there. So if you're going to an event in Orlando, for the most part, you can expect to feel very safe. Unfortunately, the city of Orlando's biggest industry, tourism, is in somewhat of a battle with the state governor, and they're trying to destroy tourism in Orlando. Despite the fact most people that come to these events are just trying to have a good time, it seems like the state of Florida really wants to attack tourism, and thus Orlando is kind of in a crucial spot right now where its economy could literally get destroyed by the governor. We've already seen what happened in Miami Beach. It seems like right now Florida's fighting these culture wars, and many times the economy of these cities can lose a lot, and Orlando isn't a vulnerable spot where it could end up losing a lot of its industry if the state continues its culture war against things like Disney World, which attract a lot of tourism to the area, and thus a lot of events like the Florida Classic, even though they're unrelated, they're still coming to Orlando because it's a tourist hub. But overall, the economy in the Orlando area is more sturdy than other parts of the state. It's not just tourism. There's a lot of great things happening in Orlando economically, but you have to be mindful that the state of Florida is kind of trying to destroy the metropolitan area's largest source of income. Without a doubt, these culture wars between Orlando's industries and the state of Florida could have some horrific effects if they continue. And of course, if you destroy an area's economy and people's livelihoods, then crime could get out of control. Let's hope that doesn't happen, but for now, Orlando is the number 2 safest city in the state of Florida. Seminole County's homicide rate is less than 5 per 100,000, well below the state average. Orange County's homicide rate is 7.5, slightly higher than the state average, which is 7.2. Osceola County is 4 per 100,000, far below the state average. And Lake County is also below the state average. Thus, we can see with homicide rates that are fairly low for the entire metropolitan area, it's a fairly safe place to be. Number 3 is Tampa, Florida. The homicide rate here is 6.8, below the state average. Overall, crime in Tampa isn't above the scales. It's a fairly safe city, and its overdose death rate is far below the state average as well. Means that Tampa, for the most part, is a crime-free city. Of course, any city this size is going to have bad neighborhoods, but for the most part, Tampa is a safe city. Known for Cuban sandwiches, the city of Tampa is a must-visit destination for a lot of tourists coming to Florida, and it's a great year-round destination to live. The city offers a much more cultural experience compared to other Florida cities. It's an older city with a lot of history, so if you want to live in a more hometown feel large city, then Tampa could definitely be it. Tampa is far from the beaches, and it is a fairly congested city. A lot of the long-time Cuban and Puerto Rican residents are moving further away from the city core to the outskirts of the metropolitan area, claiming that crime in the city is starting to become a problem for them. So while the people that are from Tampa are leaving because of crime, people from other states are flocking to this city. I used to love the city of Tampa many years ago, but today with all the people that are moving here, I'm personally not enticed by this city at all. Other than the food scene, which is definitely one of the best in the entire state. But when you compare Tampa to Indianapolis, Louisville, Chicago, Nashville, these cities are going to have homicide rates 2 to 4 times higher than Tampa. So you can see how compared to other large cities on the East Coast, Tampa is far safer. And while Tampa's not as tropical as Miami, let's say, it is still warm during the winter in comparison to cities in the Northeast. So without a doubt, it's understandable why people are leaving Philadelphia, New York, Boston, all these other large cities and coming to Tampa for safety, warm weather, hard to beat compared to the cities they're coming from. But the city doesn't have a strong economical outlook, and many people who move to Tampa end up leaving because they just can't make as much money as they thought they were going to make, or as much money as they made where they were before. Nonetheless, with relative safety and warm weather, Tampa will continue to be a hit city for people leaving the larger cities in the Northeast with good reason. Number 4 is Miami. Currently, the homicide rate in Miami is above the state average. Miami would have been number 1 a few years back, but recently crime in Miami has started to increase, and so has the city's homicide rate, currently sitting at 8.5 per 100,000. That is now above the state average. Miami has seen an explosion of population with people from everywhere wanting to move to Miami, and unfortunately those people have brought with them these high crime rates. It seems like Miami got better, and all of a sudden it started to get worse again. And Miami is still safer than the vast majority of American cities, but over the last few years things have not been looking great. The cost of living in Miami is astronomical, as well as insuring your property. On top of that, jobs in Miami just don't pay that well, making it one of the hardest places to actually make a living in the entire state of Florida. That doesn't mean that income disparity doesn't exist. The rich have a lot of money, but the poor have almost nothing. Industry tourism has been destroyed by SB 1718 coronavirus. Also did a number to the city, and thus economically Miami's tourism is starting to suffer. Now Florida's governor is going on a war against spring break, which means that the beaches of Miami Beach are practically empty in a time of the year when they should have some type of activity, and thus the economical future of Miami is somewhat uncertain at this moment. Miami-Dade County does have the lowest overdose death rate of anywhere in the state of Florida, and that is because the population here is 70% Hispanic, and this is a problem mostly affecting the white population, which is an insignificant percentage of the population here. However, while overdoses are fairly low in the city of Miami, other legal or somewhat legal versions of drugs are still prevalent in the city, and while overdosing here is uncommon, there's still plenty of illegal substances flowing through the streets and in the air in Miami. Thus, the city does have a crimey feel, and it's only getting worse as time passes. So thus, Miami is no longer the safest large city in Florida. That title has been given away. Still, Miami is much safer than number 5. Jacksonville, the last city we're going to look at today, has an absolutely unacceptable amount of violence. Miami, being just a large metropolitan area, has a few pockets like Opelika, Miami Gardens, and around Homestead that are somewhat more dangerous. But again, when you have a metropolitan area of millions of people, you're going to have pockets that are somewhat dangerous. Overall, Miami is only slightly more dangerous than the rest of Florida, so crime here isn't out of control. It's just not what it used to be. Going back to that suburb of Doral, it had 0 murders for many years, but if you look at recent news, it looks like they've had 3 murders in the last few months, which only goes to show that a city that for many years had no murders is now all of a sudden, just in a few months, seeing up to 3 homicide investigations, which just goes to show that perhaps things in Miami really are going in a bad direction. During 2020, when other cities in the United States were completely out of control, they went through a crime wave, Miami wasn't as affected. But now, in 2024, it looks like crime in Miami could be increasing, and that's not good. Overall, Miami is a fairly safe city, and again, a metropolitan area this bad will have a few spots you definitely don't want to get caught in. Miami Beach, while being touristy, to me has always felt kind of crimey, and areas like Opelika, Miami Gardens are just best simply avoided. Number 5 is Jacksonville, Florida. The homicide rate here is almost double the state average. And while I wouldn't call Miami or any of the other cities on today's list as dangerous, unfortunately, Jacksonville is a city we do have to label as dangerous. The city's homicide rate is absolutely ridiculous for being in the state of Florida. Along the beaches and in some suburbs, Jacksonville is growing. The beaches here are not as warm or pretty or tropical as other Florida beaches. The problem is that the city core is absolutely out of control. Juvenile delinquency here is bad, and pretty much if you're in Jacksonville, you're always watching out for your safety. It never really feels safe. And it's really disappointing that Jacksonville has this problem, because overall it is a beautiful city with a lot of great things to offer, but the city has always been plagued with crime, and it simply isn't getting better. But not only is the homicide rate here nearly double the state average, but Jacksonville also has a very high drug overdose death rate. Even the suburbs are littered with homelessness, crime, and addiction. There is a lot of investment and growth growing in, but that doesn't prevent the city from having a lot of problems. I'm not going to deny that great things are happening in Jacksonville, from infrastructure to investment to a lot of people moving to the city, but it doesn't change the fact that the city continues to be dangerous no matter how you look at it. Every time that I've gone to Jacksonville, I've had to take real serious precautions while recording in the city, as we've had bad incidents with threats, people chasing us in cars. Even getting off in the wrong neighborhood here could be a problem. It really is a seriously dangerous city. Duval County is almost 1 million people. When you think about 1 million people having a homicide rate of 15 per 100,000, that's a lot of people living in dangerous conditions. I think the other cities on today's list have a larger Hispanic population. They're somewhat more tropical and touristy, but Jacksonville is almost part of the Deep South culturally, so it's very distinct than the rest of these cities. St. Petersburg used to be like that, and it's the safest city on our list today, but St. Petersburg is geographically closer to South Florida, and it's been able to make that transition from a nasty Deep South city to a much more tropical vibe city, which is what people relocating to Florida want. Thus, Jacksonville, Florida is possibly the only city on today's list that I would really label as dangerous. It's got a lot of challenges to go. It is making changes, but it continues to struggle with crime, and it is possibly the only large city in Florida that I would warn you against if crime is on your list of concerns.